And I got a ton of feedback last night after Kristen Severance's story. She interviewed a National Geographic reporter who was covering the clashes downtown when he got shot in the face just below the eye there with a less lethal round. Afterward, I got a few messages that sounded a lot like this one. John said, "Hey Dan, all journalists take a risk going into a warlike zone. The reason the shooting and the tear gas occurred is because rioters and criminals started breaking the law and caused the pushback by the feds. Blame the criminals, not the federal agents. So blame game aside, the idea is if journalists are not participating in the riot, they shouldn't be targeted with rubber bullets to the face. And it's not clear that the officers in Portland are doing their part." See, last week, a district court judge blocked federal officers from targeting journalists, saying that their actions raised serious questions about the potential violations of the First Amendment. In the lawsuit, journalists claim that officers shot at them even after they identified themselves as members of the press. That said, how do police know who is press and who isn't? Honestly, I mean, there is evidence down there that shows that some of the protesters have been impersonating the media and using the fact that they're live streaming or tweeting as proof that they are members of the press. I talked about the problem with one of the local journalists that the police are accused of targeting.
Anybody can pick up a camera, can record, can report, but there's boundary lines that you need to maintain, and there's professionalism that you have to follow, conduct, ethics. There's situations of engaging with officers that I'm seeing by some of these people that are wearing press, of literally screaming at them, throwing stuff at them. That's not the right conduct. That right there.
That's Corey Elliott. He's a citizen journalist. He has captured some really intense moments during these protests, some of which we have used right here on our show.
Officers and feds, local, federal, are sitting there and questioning whether these people are legitimately press. And it's even extending towards myself and other members of the press that are out there that are legitimate reporters that have been there since day one and trying to maintain professionalism while sitting there being under fire from officers, from rubber bullets, from tear gas. And it kind of makes the situation a little bit more difficult for a lot of us to be out there.
Still, those protesters with the camera, they've been putting up live streams that have informed thousands of people. I've used some of the footage that they have gotten right here to help us tell you their stories. The question is, who do you trust to tell you these stories? And what protection should they have to keep them safe while documenting dangerous moments that you wouldn't see otherwise?